Hello and welcome to Log Talking. Today I want to just run through adding a new feature and doing it live coding so you can see how I think as I go along and what the workflow of adding a new feature is when working with Logtalk. And I work in a test-driven development way. It's just a habit of mine with Logtalk, so you'll see that as well in this. Before I get into that though, I just want to talk through the architecture a little bit because I was umming and ahhing with the really complex strategy pattern you've seen in the last video, which is really versatile and really beautiful. But I think the behavior it adds is marginal compared to the amount of complexity it adds. Because when I got round to adding in most of the like daemon facets that would run like on add do this or on delete do that, I realized that much of the capability could be achieved just through the event-driven mechanisms that Logtalk already provides. Except one small use case where I thought, well, perhaps before data is added, you might want to manipulate it a little bit and then add it, and you can't do that with the event-driven programming mechanism. Um, but for that one thing, it seemed like a lot of overhead. So I've simplified it down. I've kept that code on a branch so I can come back to it if I find I need it, but I've simplified it down to this generic way I like to organize these kind of libraries. So I've got my frames object, which is dependent on a calculate protocol, which is the only facet that really needs to be done at a point that's not before or after a call to the frames object. So that one is kind of a bit more tightly woven in. So I've got that protocol there, and frames only depends on something implementing that protocol. So when you come to doing your own library, you can just extend or implement that protocol, or implement it in a category, and then you can import that category, whatever you're doing. It makes sense to use categories for this kind of thing because you're not calling it directly, but you'd still need an object to call directly because frames is going to call it. Um, so you can extend the protocol to compose together your calculations, and then if something that's done typically like after a add, delete, update type call, like persisting some data to the disk, you can use the event-driven mechanism that's in Logtalk already. So it's much simpler if you're trying to learn how to use the frames library to get on with actually using it without having to deal with all a bunch of stuff you might not be using and don't care about. That's why I've decided to put this idea onto master and push the other to a branch for now. Okay, so we said we're going to add in a feature. Let's jump across to some code. I think that's on this tab. Nope, that's me checking spelling of rosemary. Don't want to look daft. So this is a little script I've got for just monitoring the directory that I'm in, and then when a file is updated, it runs a test for me. They'll come back green if everything works fine. They'll come back, let's put a fail in there, orange if some tests fail. I'm assuming some will. Yep. Um, and if there's some gobbledygook and it's a syntax error, something like this, a proper error, they'll come back red, just so you don't even have to read the text. You get an idea of where the tests are at. Let's open the README in a new tab here. Well, I probably wrote that a little bit quickly because I was expecting those tests to come back green. I did do it right. There we go. I debounce it so it doesn't run the tests every 2 seconds. Um, I probably wrote too quick. All right, so in the README, I've got just a couple of works in progress going on. I'm debating in the slots whether to have that as a list, as an optional list and a single value, and whether to transition between the two. But honestly, I'm really quite tempted at the moment to put them in as sets. There's some tests I thought of that could be useful of not adding in the same value twice, which you could do at the moment, and then you'd when you're querying it, then you get the same answer twice, and you're not getting nice collections of answers. It's extra data that's just duplicated and not necessary. So I'm thinking on these works in progress that are to do with the single values and lists to actually transition to sets as default, um, and everything will just go into a set then, rather than having any single values. But this is the one I want to focus on today, which is adding in a whole new subject, by which I mean a whole new frame, because at the moment we're only adding in new slots. That's all that it's capable of. So if I come to my test here, you can see the tests for adding a new slot and dealing with the list as well. They have to be separate tests. 'Cause at the moment, it's separate behavior. That will still be useful though. These tests will still run if I transition to a set. So I'm going to add in some tests first because that's how I like to work. And I want to do a test for adding a new frame and just the subject, and that will be true. Usually I like to do tests like this here, but in this case I don't think I can. Um, right, so in this, you see these tests are following a pattern. There's this test collection here of frames. Now up at the top of the file around here, I'm reading from the testdb file, which looks like this, and I'm turning that into a nested dictionary, and that's why I serve as the test collection. Uh, just having the test dictionary like this helps me to read it and navigate it. I don't usually like having extra files around in the repository for testing. I would rather have it just within the testing, so it's not that extra weird clutter, which is why I've also got um, these created objects here, because this is in the setup. I create some objects that are used in testing and delete them in the cleanup. But for the database as it stands, it is in the JSON. So let's query that so we can get our test collection of frames that we're working on in the tests. And we need to do a frame, and we need to add a frame into the frames, and we shall call it Rosemary. And we don't need any slots for this particular test. We get updated. And I just want to get the subjects out of the frames. So frame, I've spelled that wrong. They should both have S's. Frame, subjects, yep, updated. And that'll give me a list of subjects back. That's over here, first predicate in. It's using borrowing keys from the dictionary to do that. And because of the way the nesting of the dictionary works, that gives me those first set of keys, which is, see, let's come to the top of the dictionary. So the first set of keys are plant, vegetable, herb. That's the first level of the dictionary. So where are we? I've got my subjects out, and then I just want to do a membership check for Rosemary in subjects. So that's my first test. I want to make sure I can actually add a subject in. And failure. Brilliant. It is brilliant. Right, let's go to that. And I need, so this is the code where I'm adding a frame. It takes some old frames, some subject that we're going to be adding to. It takes the slots that are being added, and then it will return some new frames. In this case, it's the slots have been are empty on this particular line, which is why the old frames unify with the new frames in the typical manner we do for recursion. And then this is the recursive call. So I've got my old frames and my subject. I check to make sure that they're all ground here. Now I'm using ground because new value could be a term, and so I can't just use non-var because it could be a deeper term where it needs to be checked for ground. So I thought, oh, I'll just chuck it all in one term, then one list, and check the whole lot's ground together. Then this is a little helper predicate, does the actual inserting, and this is it gives me then those accumulated frames, and to use typical Prolog language, and then we accumulate and recurse with that. The helper predicate, it checks to see if there's that list on the values or not, and if there is a list, it prepends the new value. Otherwise, it just puts a new value in, because this should fail if it's not a list. In fact, if there's no value there, it should probably fail. That's another test I should check. There could be a flaw in my logic there. But if I'm switching it to sets, which I plan on doing, then I shouldn't need this helper thing at all, because it would always be just, well, add it into the set. But I'll have to check the behavior of the sets insert predicate before that. Anyway, so I think the best way to handle this is going to be to put all of this behind another predicate that checks on the subject first. and so these need a more honest name. Now these are actually adding in the slots to a frame, so I'm going to make them called instead of add frame slots. There we go, and get rid of the highlight. And now we can actually define what add frame will be. So add frame, we'll take a old frame, old frames even, take some subject, take the slots and give us some new frames out. And we need to see if the frames are in there, and if they're not, then we need to add it in as a new one. So this is going to give me a syntax error failure. Should do. Right, let's jump up. Because I'm going to need some extra predicates here. I'm going to need to insert a new frame if one is missing, and I'm going to need a new tree or dict, which I shall give a different name because new otherwise will confuse me. You know, when I'm writing the code, new what? New frames, new, you know. So if I call it new dict, then I know I'm getting a new dict. So I'm going to need a new one to insert in. I need a temporary thing in place. So here, this is going to be a if type statement. So look up the subject, any old value in the old frames. Right, if we've got one of those, then I've got, I'll just put true there for now, because that's a successful case. That's when the subject already exists, so we can go on to adding in the slots. I'm going to have to add in the slots though, in both cases, so I'm not going to do it on the first branch of the if. I'm going to think about what I want to do on the failure of looking up. So there is no subject right now, and how I want to handle that. So I want my new dict, because that's my temporary thing. I'll call it empty, and I want to insert into the old frames. It should be on a new line. Insert into old frames the subject, the empty dict, and that will give me, let's call it ACK frames. Give me some accumulated frames. And now I can proceed with adding the frame slots in, which takes old frames, subject, it takes those slots, gives me some new frames out, except it doesn't take old frames now, it'll take ACK frames, where I've made sure I've got my subject in, and in this case needs to be old frames unified with ACK frames. So a little bit backwards and forwards there. I hope it's not too difficult to follow along with. But that should have worked some wonders then on the tests, which don't seem to be running. Give it a restart, right? If it doesn't work, turn it off and on again. Okay. Still failing. Is it? Which test goal succeeded but should have failed? Add var subject. Okay, so that's actually a different test. That's not. We called this test add a new frame subject, but this test is failing and it wasn't failing before. And that's probably because this is a variable and I'm not checking to make sure that the subject is a variable. Well, I'm using atomic as a guard because that's the condition of the dictionaries. Oh, there we go. All the tests pass. Lovely. All right, I want to add one more test in because I'm only testing if the subject is there. I'm not testing to make sure that new slots can be added. So let's add new frame slots. And this will be true if some spacing and some height are equal. It's not unification to 1 and 12. That's what will give us values. So I've got my test collection, some frames, Frames, add frame, 2 frames, rosemary. My slots are spacing. I've got some growing in my garden, and this is about what the spacing and height is in height in inches, spacing per square foot. Oh, I should get some updated frames out of that. And then I need to do a check. So frames, if I do the get frame, I can use a shorter syntax, but it does run the reasoning. Rosemary, and I want to get the spacing. Why don't I just do this? Get frame, frames, rosemary, spacing, spacing, height. That was quicker, wasn't it? Okay, let's see if that fails. It does fail. Add new frame. Singleton variable updated. Oh, right, yeah, because it's a different set of frames. Sometimes it's the code that's broken, sometimes it's the test. Hey, there we go. Okay, cool. So that's hopefully been somewhat insightful to see how workflow is kind of doing, at least the way I work with Logtalk, writing the test and then going and adding in some new feature and thinking it through. Um, I've still got that one bit of logic that I needed to check, which was this, but well, actually, I probably don't need to check it. I'm going to go and move it over to sets, I think now, and see, and that should negate the whole need for those 3, 4 lines of code. So next video, we will be continuing on frames with the view to using them in the square foot gardening application, because the frames will contain all of the knowledge that we're querying. And I think the calculate um, protocol is going to handle a lot of the clever things we want to do as well with the complex queries such as what should I grow my garden next, or what's the for a garden, what's the diversity score for this particular garden among the different plants that are in there, and some such things. So if you've enjoyed this and you want to know more about Logtalk, you want to follow along, then hit subscribe and the bell notification, and you'll get notified as soon as a new video is out. Until next time then, happy log talking.